Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, Envisioning a Restorative Future of Work. I'm Steve Dubb, and I'm Senior Editor here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts nation. For this webinar, I'm honored to introduce our team of expert panelists who are Jessica Gordon-Embard is a professor of Africana Studies at John Jay College of the City University of New York, and is author of Collective Courage, A History of African-American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. Also with us today is Emily Quano, who's co-founder of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, co-director of Wellspring Cooperative in Springfield, Massachusetts, and a member of MPQ's Economic Justice Advisory Committee. And last but not least, we have with us Alyssa Quart, who is executive director of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project based in New York City, and is the author of 6 books, including Squeezed: Why Our Families Can't Afford America. A few notes. First, we're very excited to take your questions. We'll start with a few slides and questions and get to your questions. Second, we will share the slides and recording after the webinar. One last thing, this webinar is free, but producing it is not. So if you like what we're doing and can afford to support MPQ's racial and economic justice work, please consider donating to MPQ today. We also encourage you to join the conversation via social media. We have the hashtag Rebuild the Economy. Thanks for joining us, and there'll be a survey at the end. So if you can, please complete that to inform our future work. And with that, I'll begin with Alyssa. And Alyssa, you write obviously a lot about the culture and politics of work, and you have a new book coming out. In your research, what are you finding to be some of the more toxic ideas that people have about the world of work that they've internalized, and what are some of the more liberatory ones?
Well, so my new book is on the idea of the self-made man and how it's corroded us, starting in the 19th century, probably earlier, and continuing to this present day. In forms of individualism and the delusions around what we can do on our own, how we don't need support, how labor is supposed to function, et cetera. So it's called Bootstrapped, and it's going to be out in a year. But part of how I've come to understand what I call the bootstrapping ideology is from running this organization, the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, because a third of our writers are lower income or working class, and often they publish and we'll get these comments or letters that are saying things like, why don't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? These are about people who are struggling to get out of $17 a night Airbnbs, or out of dispiriting work at a potato chip factory when they were adjunct professors. And there's a lot of these notes and letters that are this assumption of the responsibility of people for their own suffering, and as if there's no broader market, there's nothing systemic. And these are not just deluded trolls, right? These are a lot of people. These are people that we know. Sometimes they're ourselves. And I think to me, the biggest thing that we need to work on individually, and this is not necessarily a systematic thing, it's more of a personal psychology thing, is to stop blaming ourselves and to have open conversations about some of the limitations of our work lives and our earning power and our inheritance and all this kind of thing with one another. So one of the things that I found liberatory has been, and Jessica's also going to talk about this, I've been reporting on workers' cooperatives. So workers' cooperatives have a wonderful history, a long history, often serving people post-slavery or during the Civil War. And then during the New Deal, there's a lot of she'll tell you more about this, I'm sure, that sort of helped poor populations throughout the country. And today there's a range of them. And there's sort of like a more transcendent kind of union. To me, it's like, obviously we need more unions as part of this liberatory movement, but we also need more of an ideological shift around work and the worker cooperatives. Yeah.
You want to walk us through? I know you took a few photos that you wanted to show folks.
Oh yes. Can we see some of the photos, please? So these are photos, by the way, of this toxic narrative, because these are subjects of a piece that I wrote with Astra Taylor, who's a debt advocate. Some of you may have heard of her. And these are all medical workers who, during the height of COVID, we were clapping for them at 7 o'clock in the evening. But this is the kind of debt they had. They were RNs, they were respiratory therapists, people who were really on the front lines, and yet look at this medical debt. This is pure medical debt. And it mostly, of course, held by women and people of color because they didn't have families who could pay off their debt. So that's the story there. And that was our argument was, and this could be a liberatory argument. It's both a terrible argument. Oh, people are responsible for their own debt and their own condition. And a liberatory one, if we're applauding for them at 7, let's strike their debt. Let's forgive their debt. And so that was the argument there. We have 1.7 trillion in student debt, and that is holding so many of us back in our work lives, not just young people, but in general. So yeah, and then if you keep going, we'll see some of the images of the, this is called Drivers Cooperative. And right now, I believe it's the largest. It's bigger than the nursing one, Jessica. It's got like 2,500 drivers last I checked. And the idea, of course, is to go up against Uber and Lyft to give the drivers something like 40% of their earnings, as opposed to Uber has like 50, to take, not 40%, Uber takes a huge amount of the drivers' earnings, and this Go Co-op or Drivers Cooperative is going to give them the vast majority of their earnings, and so that is part of it. And one of the things that's interesting to me about this is that you can be part of the Drivers Cooperative or Go Co-op. It's going by both names, or and also part of Lyft and Uber. So to me, that's kind of a radical thing. It's giving people multiple possibilities for ways into a utopian project, right? And to me, that for gig economy, you have something like 57 million people who are at some point participating in the gig economy now with very few job protections. To tell them, oh, you can't, if you're going to join a workers' cooperative, could be hard. But to tell them that it could be actually a menu, especially if it's stuff like TaskRabbit, or I'm thinking about another group I wrote about, Co-opify. That's a cleaning workers cooperative in New York. And so, you could still be part of Handy or whatever that is. It's called Handy with the evil glove. It's a huge gig economy for cleaning, and also Co-opify, I believe. So this is a sort of both and strategy that I think would be really helpful. And as I said, liberatory. I guess there's another image here. Yeah, so this is an image of one of the drivers. And also the owners of this, the worker owners of this cooperative are taxi drivers. They're people, I think predominantly people of color. And so it's a sort of, it's both monetary, but also it's about being enfranchised. So you're no longer being controlled by an ownership class that is kind of, you're getting a teeny percent and doing all the work, but this is your baby.
Great, thanks, Alyssa.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. Jessica, you've written extensively about worker co-ops, particularly in the Black community and among incarcerated workers. Could you talk a little bit about the market and non-market benefits of co-ops and how worker co-ops can help create that more liberatory workplace?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for setting the stage, Alyssa. And also I'll do a land acknowledgement, and also let's bring our ancestors into the room. I want to definitely acknowledge the ancestors who have used cooperatives and solidarity economics for liberation. So what I found in my research, a lot of it is in Collective Courage, the book I wrote in 2014, I think it was. But we've learned that co-ops address market failure, so lack of goods and services in communities, especially because they're not quote unquote profitable for profit-making businesses, right? Capital flight in communities where businesses leave a community because they think they can make more money or more profit somewhere else. Co-ops help to keep capital local, to keep it anchored and recirculating. They're also a good strategy for any group of people who are discriminated against, because it's a way for the people who are discriminated against to pool together their resources to address that discrimination in ways that are more sensitive, give them more control. In a minute, I'll go through some more specifics, but I just wanted to kind of set the overall benefits. Increase in quality of goods and services, because often it's not that there aren't any goods or services, but the quality is bad in certain communities and for certain groups of people. Help to save costs, that increases income and wealth, ability to own and create ownership opportunities, create decent jobs, and then some kind level of independence and self-determination through economic options. Now, for worker co-ops in general, and specifically, we know that they actually help. The worker co-ops that we know about currently and in the past have led their industries in providing living wages, or wages at least higher than industry standards, providing higher quality work with a variety of benefits, including sick, health, and retirement benefits, which often a lot of low skill work doesn't provide. Creating local jobs with meaningful work, ownership and governance, which also create higher productivity, so that we know that when workers own and help to govern their places of work, their productivity is higher. We've got great data about that, and from 70s on up, keeping jobs in the neighborhood, creating new jobs as the co-op grows, supporting local job ladder opportunities, as well as spin-off businesses. So all those are kind of what we would call the market values, market benefits. The non-market benefits are establishing democratic control over income. We didn't really explain what a co-op is, but they are member-owned, jointly owned enterprises that are governed collectively, sharing profits, sharing resources, and then having a sense of concern for community, solidarity with other cooperatives, and the importance of education, knowledge about the industry, and how to make decisions democratically about the industry. So we know the non-market benefits are a lot of social capital. So democratic control, democracy, teamwork, value in promoting teamwork. Leadership development is one of the really fascinating things that I found, because of the way that you have to interact with other people in a co-op. You develop leadership and a variety of different kinds of capacity skills. Not, because you're governing, not just doing your one little widget job, but you're helping to govern and make decisions about the whole enterprise. So that develops capacity, and other ways to do self-management, right? And so finally, I'll just give a couple of quick examples through history in African American communities. We had organizations like in the Great Depression, a group called Cooperative Industries in DC, which helped women who were unemployed and unable to get jobs to start making their own. I think they were doing mattresses and barrels as a worker cooperative, and then they got into farming. There's from the 1960s on up, there's Freedom Quilting Bee, which are quilters, women who were actually sharecropping with their families, but also doing quilting in the winter, started a quilting co-op, and that gave them lots more access and control over their art, but also over a business that brought in income, that allowed their families to own land, the co-op to own land, and they did expanded into other things like childcare and other issues that address the needs that they had in their community. They were able to do because they were their own company. We also know there's nursing co-ops, catering co-ops. We even have some food co-ops that are worker owned, not just consumer owned. And then we've got the examples of the taxi co-ops that are, there's some that have existed already, but the new ones that are coming up now with the gig economy. And then finally, I've also been studying incarcerated worker co-ops. And again, if we think about incarcerated people, especially Black and brown incarcerated people, very much at the margins of the margins, right? Very much the most exploited. In fact, they often are forced to do slave labor, that kind of thing. Well, owning their own worker co-op while incarcerated, or being a member of a worker co-op while incarcerated, has made huge benefits in the places that have done it. Now, the US doesn't do it except for Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has about 4 examples. One very strong one but unfortunately, a lot of them have had to cease over COVID because they had to move prisoners around to different locations during COVID, but they're hoping to restart it. But an artist co-op that was able to really bring the members, right, control over income, being able to sell their art, making enough money to send home money to their families, to raise, to be able to have a little bit of money while they were still in prison. The governance, being able to govern their own company, make memorandum of understanding with the corrections office so that they could use their computers, use space, and pay rent for it, that kind of thing, all empowered them in ways that really are intangible, because some of it is just leadership and confidence building, as well as being able to earn a living and own an asset, which is their workplace. And we have great examples in Italy, Sweden, Uruguay. I think Brazil is starting to do this also, and seeing the benefits of giving workers this kind of level of control and flexibility in the ways that they operate, and the ways that they can, increasing their options to make a living, and therefore make more liberatory relationships to work.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Really appreciate that. A lot there. Emily, I want to get you in the conversation, and I'm always, I know you write a lot about this and talk a lot about the need to think of in terms of a solidarity economy, not just in terms of jobs, but in terms of livelihoods. I find that a fascinating concept. So can you talk about how that would work, and what do you mean by that?
Sure, yeah, thanks. So great to be here. So great conversation. So far we've been talking about jobs as a way to, as a big component of a livelihood. So what is a livelihood? A livelihood is how you meet your basic needs, right? Food, shelter, health, education, right? Your basic needs. How do you do that? So you can get money, right? And then how can you get money to purchase your basic needs? You could have a job, you could have wealth, right? Which generates income, and then you can spend that money on what you need. Another way to think about how you could get money is you could borrow, you could go into debt. But another way is through some kind of like public sharing, like a universal basic income or any number of social welfare programs, right? So there's all that individual stuff, right? Jobs or being wealthy or going into debt. And then there are collective ways of meeting your needs through UBI or transfer payments or social welfare programs. So beyond thinking of just money as a way of meeting your livelihood needs, I think it's also important to think about non-monetary approaches like DIY, do it yourself, right? So it might be growing your own food. It might be canning your own food. It might be knowing how to sew your own clothes. It might be community production, right? It might be trading with other people. I make bread, you cut my hair, right? That kind of stuff. It could also be community gardening. There are some efforts to really pull it all together. So it is articulating a post-capitalist solidarity economy system. So a good example of this is Cooperation Jackson, which is an organization that is working on, like, they've bought up land, so they have farming, they have housing, they have a community land trust. Sorry, let me get rid of this. Sorry. So they have a community land trust, which is supporting permanently affordable housing. They have a high-tech makerspace with 3D printers and CAD. Anyway, lots of technology that I don't even understand. But they're working on how to collectively produce some of the things that they need in their community. They have a community center as a gathering place for cultural events and education and a meeting space and childcare. What else? Oh, and also just a lot of cultural stuff. So it's really grounded in Black self-determination. And so a lot of the property that they've been buying up is very strategic in terms of historic sites in the struggle for liberation and civil rights. So that's like a very interesting, and they just bought a plaza, a shopping plaza, where they're looking to open up a food co-op, and then there's room for other kinds of businesses as well. So that's a really joined up strategy of community production, everything from low tech, community gardening, agriculture, all the way up to high tech, this community production fab lab. It's an interesting model of community production. But even if it isn't quite such a joined up strategy, just thinking that there are a lot of ways to meet our basic needs beyond just money, right? No doubt for the foreseeable future, jobs and various ways of having an income will be important. But there are many things that are already accessible to us that we can do for ourselves, or even better, that we can do collectively for ourselves. And why is that important? One thing that I think we should be mindful of is I think what's going to be a very drastic shift in the job market with AI, artificial intelligence, and automation. There was a study done recently that said that 40% of jobs in the United States are vulnerable to being automated. Now, this was not
I'm going to ask about that down the road. So let's
Shall I just stop that one? Okay,
let's stop there.
That one. Okay.
Thanks.
Right.
So really important though. So thanks for setting that out and not having us just focus narrowly on jobs. I really appreciate that. Going back to jobs for a little bit, Alyssa, we had this concept that became, was in 2020, we discovered the phrase essential worker, right? Sometimes I think essential worker means we don't have to pay you for what you're worth, but but thinking about it a little less cynically, what lessons have we learned from the treatment of essential workers that we have witnessed in the pandemic? You're on mute.
So I have tons of things to add to everything you guys are saying. So I can't wait to talk to you, Emily and Jessica. And again, I'm on Lenape land, and thank you for having me, Steve. I just jumped in before, but so with essential work, so we, I run this organization, this journalism organization around economic distress, and when COVID happened, we were like, first of all, are journalists essential workers? That was a question. And we were sort of told we weren't, but suddenly there was, we were getting dozens upon dozens of requests just for money. So we immediately started a fund, like $100,000 fund that we just dispensed, that was just given to journalists who are struggling. So that's the first thing we did with that. Not for producing work, which is normally we pay money for people to do things. But this time we're like, we have to throw out that philanthropic canard that you have to give people money for, brilliance. And you just have to give people money so they can get through this time, because it's the people you're supporting as much as the work. So this is back to the livelihood question. That's what we did. But then one of the things that was striking to me was all these pieces about essential work. We were celebrating people, but things like curbside delivery, the Times had tons of articles about curbside delivery, as if there's no human hands there, as if it's like this abstraction, So at some point I got a grocery store worker who's also an activist, Ann Larson, to write a piece about that, because she basically said, I am curbside delivery. When you're in all these articles that are just kind of blindly, talk about bubble, they're blindly where do you get the best curbside delivery of your health food? it's like a human being. And so let's stop, kind of, I don't know, I want to say anthropomorphizing, but like dehumanizing something that is deeply human. Because we're obviously think some people are human that need to be protected and some people are not. And so we can keep talking about essential work. And the other thing about essential work was immediately after I started interviewing people for my book and just generally, and I talked to like Instacart workers, the people who are shopping for people getting macaroni and cheese, and sponges and stuff, and you probably see this kind of army of them if you ever went shopping during the pandemic. And they weren't given hand sanitizer, they weren't giving masks. The woman I interviewed used rot gut, Everclear, which is like this terrible alcohol to sanitize things. And her husband were both doing this. And so this to me was like, wow, we were calling these people essential. Again, we're applauding them. It's like those medical workers in that image I showed earlier, who are $200,000 in debt. And it's a real hypocrisy around this. Now, there was hazard pay, right? There were these moments in which people were suddenly given, but by and large, if we look at it now, they've been clawed back. And people are now wondering, why don't people want to do this sort of dirty work, difficult jobs, low paid jobs? Because your boss was willing to see you get sick or die. Like, why would you do those jobs now? I mean, obviously some people have to, but, or if you're working for Amazon and it is $15 an hour, you're in a union that's going to get busted. Like, I think there's been a lot of signs of what people really think of essential work, which was like, so they saw people who were essential and then they unsaw them again. And so I'm trying to figure out whether there's solidarity and collectivism is going to win in the end, and this kind of awareness, seeing the unseen labor, or we're just going to go back to this like confusion about what's important. Yeah, there's a moment where we understood what was important, and now I feel like it's sort of dissipating, and the people who are still doing those jobs are really sad and angry about it. And one other thing I wanted to point out about the list of essential workers, there were things on that list that I don't know if anyone looked at the list. Dry cleaning. Now, look, I like my silk shirt here, but like, this is not essential. So it was also like essential for who? Who is this essential for profit? Essential for the smooth sailing of the East Hampton, Bridgehampton house, or wherever that the overclass is going to go to in the summer. So I think that's another thing. Some of the classification of essential was more expansive in strange ways than I would have thought, and to the point of meaninglessness. So those are my thoughts on that.
Great, thanks. So Emily, I promised to get back to you on automation. So please take it away. And so, at some level, automation theoretically could be a positive contribution, right, to, getting rid of less pleasant labor. And it can also be a tool that makes work more difficult, or the monitoring that you see at Amazon, for example. But how would a solidarity economy, address that automation?
I think it's a really important question. Who is controlling it, automation and AI, and how is it being deployed? I mean, I think it could be extraordinarily dystopian, or it could be quite utopian, right? And right now, it feels like that struggle over democratic control over that kind of technology is not very live, at least in the sort of the social movement circles that I'm in. It's not very live. It just feels like it's in a different sphere. So I think it's important, right? So the dystopian view is not only is there a lot of job loss, right? So that study where in the next 20 years, 40% of US jobs are vulnerable. No, that's vulnerable. It's not a prediction. But those are the jobs that could pretty easily be replaced by AI and automation, right? Like, even if it is just a fraction of 40%, like that is a total game changer, right? Like, imagine 10, 15% job destruction. Like, that's really dramatic. We should think about that. That's a dystopian direction. The utopian direction would be, okay, that's actually good, right? A lot of these jobs can be automated, especially the more drudgerous ones. And we actually have more time to engage in things that we enjoy. And hopefully livelihoods are part of what we enjoy, not only what we enjoy, but part of livelihoods is also how do we create things that are actually more affordable? How do we have more affordable housing? How do we have more affordable education? How do we have more affordable healthcare, right? So that's part of it. But then how do we also provide for ourselves? Because we as human beings, we not only are generally hardwired to work together, but we like to accomplish things. We like to have that feeling of accomplishment. And when we make something, whether it's a mental effort or it's a physical product or a service, like that's very enjoyable. And if we could take the precarity out of it, like it's life or death, like if people had in a solidarity economy where people's basic needs are being met through a job, through a combination of community production, some kinds of UBI, some income generation, some jobs, then you can engage in that livelihood stuff as fulfilling and rewarding as opposed to drudgery. So yeah, I think in a solidarity economy, thinking about livelihood really supports this belief that that part of us at least is hardwired to work together. We're social beings, we're cooperative, we engage in mutual aid. So yeah, I think it's very, very consistent with the vision and the values of a solidarity economy.
Great, thanks. I think there's a question, so I'm going to go to some of the audience. Well, I want to ask Jessica this question first. There's a lot of great questions from the audience, and we'll get to those shortly. Jessica, could you talk a little bit about, how labor practices from the system of incarceration affect the broader world of work, and what worker co-ops might do to disrupt those patterns?
Right. So similar to what actually both Emily and Alyssa were already talking about, but or maybe your audience doesn't know that in the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery everywhere except for people who were duly convicted of a crime. So that means slavery is actually legal in prison. And we often talk about slave labor as if it's just kind of an adjective for bad work, but technically in some ways it is really slave labor. And so the fact that we tend, since the 70s or so, we've been using incarceration as a way to keep a reserve army, take potential employees out of the labor force and into the slave labor system. We had a system like that called the convict labor system in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where you literally created crimes that Black people fit, like loitering, being unemployed, whatever was a crime. You were put in jail, and then the former plantation owners, or they're still plantation owners, the former masters then hired you from the state to work on chain gangs and to work in there, right, to do all the slave labor that they couldn't get other people to do. So we have a history of that. We continue to treat incarcerated people that way. We force them to work for companies that pay them, pennies for the hour of their work. We often take whatever earnings they have and make them pay for room and board in prison with it, that kind of thing. We should do a thing like Alyssa did with the debt, right? Because I was shocked. Some states, actually, the prisoners are in so much debt between paying restitution and paying for their room and board, like $90,000, $100,000 of debt while they're in prison that they amassed while in prison. And so even if they got out of prison, right, and got a poor job, they would still be in huge debt to the state. So all those issues about debt, working with high levels of debt, working for pittance of wages, no benefits, no work, no control over your work rules, right? All encapsulated and, symbolized and happening in prison, then we do have, and we're supposed to have more and more in the next 5 years, more and more people being let out of prison, but they don't have the right skills. They don't have any experience in self-determination or any kind of control over their own work and their own skills. They're often not up to date on the newest skills. And so either we're going to be flooding the current market with people who have been left out and marginalized for so long, or we're going to be increasing the unemployed, right? And then the more unemployed you have, the more control capitalists have over labor, because they can hire almost anybody at whatever wages they want because there's so many people who need work. Now, I have been arguing lately, like Alyssa has, that, people are more aware of the bad jobs that are out there and less willing to take them now, and more willing to say, I can't do this job unless I have better health coverage, better protections, better pay, this kind of stuff. But we still have this huge problem with, the bottom line being, prison labor, right? And so how do you work up from that horrible low slave labor? So many of us don't realize that slave labor really actually exists and brings down, right, the whole labor quality for the whole society. I think that's probably the easiest way to talk about that.
No, that's great. It's horrible, but it's a very good explanation of what's going on. And if you look at Florida and how they've, there was a vote to give formerly incarcerated folks the right to vote, and then the technicality that invalidated that is exactly what you're talking about. So that's a huge issue. Thanks.
Right. So the last part of your question. Yeah. So if we raise, right, if we're able to use worker cooperatives and other better labor schemes while in prison, if we have to continue to have prisons, right, that should raise the quality of work throughout the whole system.
Great, thanks. So I have a ton of questions from our audience. They're very active. I'm going to try to run through as many as we can in a short period of time. So we'll see how it goes. One question that came up is about our, not surprising perhaps because it's Nonprofit Quarterly, but a popular question is about in what ways does the nonprofit industrial complex pose barriers to creating the liberatory structures that are being advocated? And anyone can jump in on that. It looks like Alyssa wants to, but you're muted, so please.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this because, so I've been running this thing for like 7 years. And I mean, especially during COVID, I saw really clearly that we need to treat, we certainly needed to treat that to sort of what I'm thinking of as disaster philanthropy, or philanthropy that's reactive, responsive, participatory, democratized. The most famous person who's sort of doing some strange version of this is Mackenzie Scott, but there's many, many other people who are now trying to do this, right? It's more grassroots. But I think the main thing here is it's also less strings attached. So what I think that donors need to think about, big philanthropy needs to think about is, and this may sound kind of in the weeds if people are not in philanthropy or nonprofits, but don't be like a spouse looking over your partner's credit card bill, which is sort of what philanthropies can be like now with their grantees. Like, oh, you spent on, why'd you spend, this is sort of tranches, larger tranches that are less specific, that are more general operating, that maybe are longer for longer periods, and also to organizations that are smaller. I think one of another mistake that big philanthropy sometimes makes is it gives money to the big stars, and then that often goes into administration. Let's be frank, because these are big organizations; they're like corporations. So one of the things that Mackenzie Scott has been doing somewhat, right, is giving money to, say, smaller colleges, community colleges. I read somewhere that community colleges get 1.5% of the broader giving to higher ed. So that's an example. And in, nonprofit land that I'm in, the teeny journalism nonprofits and the other arts nonprofits and the labor nonprofits that are small also get a teeny proportion of the general funds that are coming in from big philanthropy. So the idea is to try to look for that to be more rigorous, really. So I think that's one thing that philanthropy can do. I think it can also be supporting worker cooperatives. Like, I think there's no reason why we can't be thinking about some of these ideas, and also some of the ideas Emily had. You know, in my last book, Squeezed, I wrote about co-housing, co-parenting organizations, but also people who are just doing it on their own. I mean, I think, so I can explain that. That's a version of what Emily was talking about, but it's around daycare. So it'll be people who are not biologically or romantically linked, living in the same house. And there's one in Jamaica Plain, Emily, because I know you're Boston adjacent. And they, you know, took care of each other's kids. They shared meals. They shared the cost of the house. And I interviewed other people who were in upstate New York and blah, blah, blah. But I was like, there should be organizations supporting this. These are the kinds of DIY structures that are with a little boost of something a little more systemic, not hugely systemic, but they could really be made to work. So yeah, that's my third thing about philanthropy, that it should be focused on some of these solutions and giving people back ownership, supporting alt labor, et cetera.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
I do think it's interesting that nonprofits as well as foundations are looking at system change, which I think is really interesting and really a necessary conversation. And as Steve well knows, right, we're in a lot of these same conversations. I really believe we do need to grapple with what are you talking about when you're talking about system change? Are you talking about reforming capitalism? That's one position. It's a position. It's a legitimate position. I don't want to throw stones. I just profoundly disagree. So solidarity economy is clearly post-capitalist in its vision, believing that we're not going to get to that more just and sustainable and democratic world through reforming capitalism. We have to move beyond it. And just one indication, the grant makers in the arts, and I think there's an NPQ article on this coming out soon, commissioned a study of solidarity economy and the arts. And some very big foundations are in that space. So this is interesting. We're in this moment, like once in a generation, once in two generation moment, where there's a lot of possibility to go for pretty profound paradigm shifts. So having that conversation, the time is now to be pushing that. And not everybody has to agree, but we should at least have that conversation.
Great. Jessica, did you want to jump in on this too?
Yeah, I'll just say something quickly. I agree totally with Emily and Alyssa. The only other thing I wanted to say, and I think the question kind of came from this perspective, which is we are finding in the co-op and solidarity economy world, and sorry again for the noise. I thought I had a quiet. We are finding that often, philanthropy and grants and things are kind of operating. They have their own notion about what solidarity and what co-op means and what racial justice means, and they're pushing that and not letting the organizations do it the way we know how, or do it, as Emily said, to move toward a post-capitalist. They're almost trying to keep the status quo going by being PC, but not right. So we do have to really figure out how to both use this moment where philanthropy seems to be more interested in really making change, but also push that envelope. And I just think we have to really, really honest, right, about the need to push that envelope and to really think about changing the paradigm totally, much more labor-friendly, labor control, right, kinds of policies and support for all the things that are really trying to make a difference, not for these sort of feel good stuff that just look good on paper but aren't really making a difference. And sorry, I just sort of felt like I had to say that.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Can
Thanks.
I add one thing?
All right. We're trying to get to some more questions too.
Okay,
so
but I just wanted to add that there are people who, like there are big foundations that are doing, like Ford has been really trying to do democratization. So like we can point to ones that have been listening. I don't think that I don't want to like tar everyone with the same brush, but I think that, I think it's, as you said, it's really important that we don't just move around the furniture, talk about justice, and still keep this kind of third wave Democrat Aspen Ideas Festival kind of mindset in philanthropy, and instead really try to be serving the people at the bottom. So there you go.
Thanks. So there was an interesting question about complementary or alternative currencies, and I don't know if anyone wanted to jump in about how they might help boost local co-op economic models. If any of you have done work on that.
I haven't really. The only thing I would say about local currencies they are a way to kind of help monetize invisible work and barter relationships. So I know that some communities have had some luck with people who can't sort of aren't in the formal exchange system and can't get hold of money for the things for the work that they do, but they can do it through time banking and local currencies. It is a way, but I don't really know a lot about it, so I don't want to say too much about it. And I think people connect it with co-ops, but it's more of one of the menu pieces of a whole solidarity system. It's not really about co-op specifically.
Right.
That's right. Sorry, I was distracted. I was trying to read the comments. And so the question was local currency, social currency, and co-ops. There are some examples where, where co-ops are very deliberately saying, yes, we can accept local currency. So it supports that and try to integrate that into the model. For sure, it's a good fit.
Great.
Absolutely.
Another question was about, and this gets to the Go co-op versus Uber and all of that, but what are the mechanisms that, given the arithmetic of the market, if you will, as it exists right now, how do co-ops avoid a race to the bottom type of dynamic and actually lift standards?
I can start. So my day job is I'm a co-op developer, and we're developing a network of worker-owned businesses in low-income neighborhoods, underserved communities in Springfield, Massachusetts. Our pricing, so we have a greenhouse, we have an upholstery shop, we have a window restoration shop, we have a cleaning co-op. Prices are competitive. I would say one of the reasons why our edge, right, in marketing is that we're a co-op. Now, it does help to be in Western Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a pretty liberal state, and so there's a lot of receptivity to that, right? People support us because we are a co-op, and they buy our products because we're a co-op. So that's a nice thing. The other form of demand is we did originally build on an anchor institution approach. So we spent years developing relationships with anchor institutions. In other words, these major institutions that are anchored in place, like hospitals and colleges, right? So we have good relationships, and that has proved to be really critical at some points when we just ran out of work, like a job got canceled, and we went to, say, the hospital system, Bay State Health, and said, help. And they turned around on a dime, and they were able to scrounge up some work enough to get us through. That's an example. So there are some advantages to being a.
Very good, thanks. Alyssa, I think this is a question for you. It's not labeled as such, but and it was a request to talk about migrant farm workers, who certainly fall within the essential worker category. How are they, were you able to cover them at all? Do you have any stories you can
we do have, I haven't personally covered migrant farm workers, but we have been as an organization. I'll share, when I stop talking, I'll share David Bacon's incredible pictures actually from the COVID period, where he's been sort of on this in California. And same with Matt Black, who did a thing called Geography of Poverty. And so they both done a lot of really remarkable work for us, shooting these workers who, many of whom were infected with COVID because they had to continue to be, picking fruit or what have you, and living in close quarters, et cetera. So yes, I will share those. One of the questions should I just mention a question that interested me?
Sure.
So there's two, but there's many more, but the us versus them, somebody said, how do we package, and I'd love to talk to everybody here about this. How do we package, we have such a divided political culture right now, right, whatever, 40% of Trump supporters. How do we package what we believe and what we're interested in for these folks? And I think one of the ways to do it is, talk about dignity, right? I mean, part of the worker co-op project and some of these alternative structures in general, mutual aid, is to not rely on charity. Remember, I told you about all those angry commenters who would write to me about the poor writers and how dare they complain about their lives, right? But you could say, part of being a worker co-op is to want to participate in a dignity economy and a solidarity economy and to do a good day's work. Even though I, like Emily, agree that there's all sorts of ways to define oneself that is about accomplishment and production, but not about labor in the traditional sense, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing for that packaging thing is I think we have to talk about people's feeling that their economy is their fault. And that's something I write about a lot in my last book, Squeezed, and my new book too, about the shame and stigma of being trapped in a work world, which is super contingent and fragile and without a clear, I call it, the arc of your life. It's existentially uncertain as well as economically. And I think, part of that is to keep repeating it's not your fault and to encourage people to have open conversations about their economic condition with each other. So that to me crosses part of the disgruntled Trump supporters are people who were very anxious about losing their, I don't think working class predominantly, but they're lower middle class standing, right? And so these conversations could be helpful in that regard, right? That co-ops and general dignity economics is about acknowledging what's your fault and what's not, and trying to address it as much as you can, but then also talk more broadly about the ways in which you're squeezed and pinched.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
There's a question here about, there's a whole range of new economic approaches. So this might be for Jessica or Emily, I'm not sure, but things like donut economics and so forth. And how does that relate to what's being discussed here? What are sort of the similarities and differences, however you want to take that?
Emily, did you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, there are an awful lot of these different systems, and we could go through them, and some of them are quite sectoral. Like donut economics, for example, does not touch what kind of a system, right? It's really focused on environment, carrying capacity, sustainability. It's agnostic, as far as I can tell, on the capitalism, post-capitalism issue. And I just, I'm an economist by training, and I just feel like it is really fundamental. But there are lots, right? There's green, there's community, there's this, that, and the other. There's lots and lots of overlap. That's, if you try to categorize, you just see there's huge amount of overlap. And there's probably bits and pieces of all of them that work together. But
I've been
go ahead, Jessica.
I've been focusing on the overlap, right? I talk a lot about values-based economics, right? And where are the connections in terms of values, right? Values and principles. And actually, I was just having a conversation, I forget where it was, about that we often in the co-op world, we often talk about the 7 principles of co-ops, but not the values of co-ops. But the values of co-ops are really what matter. And when you connect the values of cooperative economics with the values of solidarity economics, with some of these other values, and those values being, non-exploitation, organic diversity, pluralism, democracy, equity, right? If we think about those values in our economic system, that's where a lot of these things overlap. And to me, that's where it's most important for us to focus. I'm really less worried about terminology and isms. I'm really more interested in these values, right, of human dignity, democracy, participation, equity, because I think that's what's going to really get us transformed to a new paradigm and to new ways of being. And I think those are important because I think it's important for humanity's sake, right? I think humanity, we're drowning in exploitation and capitalism and degradation and anti-environmentalism and stuff. And we're not right. We're not going to make it as human beings. We're not going to make it as any of the societies we care about if we continue on that road, right? So we need the high road. We need the road that's about human, right? Not just human survival, but human liberation and human dignity. And we have, right? We've been talking today, all three of us, and even you, Steve, talk and write about all these other ways that we can do this. We've actually practiced what I call everyday solidarity. So much of the stuff that Emily talked about early on is stuff that we actually do as human beings all the time, but we're not allowed somehow in our system, we're not allowed to call it economics, right? We're not allowed to see ourselves as economists. We're not allowed to see ourselves in the work we do, right? It's either invisible or denigrated or whatever, but most of the time we're working with other people. We're moving from survival to institutionalization to to liberation.
Yeah.
But we're not allowed to either talk about it or recognize it. And we don't even always know how to talk about it or connect with other people. We just kind of do it because we're human beings. And so I'm hoping that the kinds of things that we're all talking about will help us to articulate, feel comfortable, and move forward with saying, this is the world. These are the kinds of jobs. This is the world we want to live in. This is what we want to create. We want more of this, and to push the envelope so that we can get there, right? Because now we know how these systems work and that they do work, right? It's now a matter of getting people comfortable with them, knowledgeable enough about them to go forth and do it.
Great. So one last question. I guess you guys get like 30 seconds each for an impossible question to answer, but what would, give a couple sentences about what your vision of a restorative future of work would look like.
So for me, it's an ecosystem of solidarity economics, including cooperative enterprise ownership, where again, we solve problems collectively with all those values I talked about. We operate our economics, our social and economic relationships according to those kinds of values. And we make sure that we have interlocking systems. So we address our housing, our food, our health, our environmental issues, all using these solidarity cooperative principles and structures that we already know work. And we just make sure to build upon them, do more and more of them, and keep building on them and interrelating them. So we create a whole ecosystem. I like small, right? So I want us to keep sort of small democratic enterprises, but they can interrelate and federate and supply each other and all that kind of stuff so that the whole system is based on that and operates that way.
Great. Alyssa, I know you wanted to get in there.
Well, so I have a few things. One is, what I started out with about the narrative around bootstrapping and being self-made, the individualism. I think some of this is a mindset question. I think we have to try to overthrow this narrative. It's a paradigm shift. It's like, me too, honestly. It's like, how do we really start to, an anti-bootstrapping campaign, I think, so people recognize not just solidarity in terms of labor, but in general, and how these toxic stories that people are telling themselves and are being told have gotten into on a cellular level, and how they relate to one another, how they think of themselves. I, of course, support the workers' cooperative, mutual aid, and other participatory budgeting, like related kinds of cooperative projects that people are doing. I think that's, and on a journalism level, I think we need something akin to a federal writers project. And that was something I called for a year ago. It's being taken up in Washington State now. That federal writers project, it ran from 1935 to the early 40s. It supported I think 6,600 journalists and photographers. It led to, Walker Evans, James Agee, and tons of other people whose names we don't know, but and that kind of support for our journalism, again, considering it essential, may have to come from our federal and state government. Ultimately, the Federal Writers Project actually became a state initiative, which most people don't remember. And so this may be state, maybe Washington State, it might be New York State, but it will be supporting journalists so they can continue to do their work.
Great, thanks. Emily, I'll give you the last word here.
Yeah, so I guess totally what Jessica said, right? Working in a solidarity economy framework, absolutely. And a lot of what that comes down to me, is thinking about like who is the central character for in a capitalist framework? Homo economicus, right? Economic man, individualistic, calculating, rational, trying to get the best deal for himself, right? And that's what capitalism as a model, as a paradigm is built on, that character, that assumption of human nature. And solidarity economy, which is very much just built around values, does recognize that exists. Homo economicus exists in us, but at the same time, we are creatures that love, and we are reciprocal, and we are altruistic, and we cooperate. I mean, this is part of our DNA also. And so trying to build a society and a economy that's balanced is really important. And to me, that a solidarity economy is the biggest tent that's trying to pull all these pieces together that exist, right? Some of them are invisible. Some of them are just looked at little cute, isolated, boutique kind of things, but they exist. They're successful if we could get them pulling in the same direction and together. Yeah, there's a huge foundation to build on.
Great. We got to as many questions as we could. Thanks for all your excellent questions. And I want to thank our panelists, Emily Kawano of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, Alyssa Quart of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and Jessica Gordon-Nemhard from John Jay College. Thanks so much. For those, please do fill out the evaluations, and you can mark on your calendar our next webinar. Will be looking at housing and housing justice, and will be on Thursday, July 15th at the same time, 2 o'clock Eastern. Expect more information coming out about that shortly. So thanks again, everyone, and until next month.
Thanks.
Thank you.